The Velern Empire had conquered 347 star systems. They had destroyed civilizations that were old when their own species was still crawling in the mud. Their warships blocked out the light of suns, and their soldiers numbered in the trillions. For 2,000 years, no species had ever refused their demands. No species had ever survived trying. When their long-range sensors detected the small blue planet called Earth, their scouts spent 3 years studying the creatures who lived there. Humans, they called themselves. Soft bodies. Short lives. No claws, no armor, no venom. They had only recently learned to travel between stars, and their technology was primitive compared to the Great Velern. War machines. The Emperor's advisors called it an easy conquest. The military commanders called it a waste of resources. Some even suggested they simply ignore the humans and let them die out on their own in a few thousand years. But Emperor Morthax the Eternal was a collector of worlds. He wanted Earth. He wanted to add humanity to his long list of conquered species. And so he sent his invasion fleet 5,000 warships carrying 10 million soldiers to claim another prize for his empire. The fleet arrived at the edge of human space on a cold Tuesday morning. Earth time. They positioned themselves in perfect formation, their massive ships gleaming against the darkness of space. Then, as was tradition, they sent their war cry. The Velern war cry was famous across the galaxy. It was not just a message. It was a psychic scream, a broadcast designed to break the minds of weaker species. It carried with it images of destroyed worlds, burning cities, and species that had been erased from existence. It promised pain. It promised suffering. It promised that resistance was not just useless, but would only make the inevitable destruction worse. The message reached Luna Base at exactly 900 hours. General Park Jin-ho was drinking his second cup of coffee when the alarm started screaming. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many wars. He had fought in the Mars Rebellion, the Belt Conflicts, and the bloody corporate wars that had nearly torn humanity apart before they finally united under one government. He thought he had seen everything. He was wrong. The war room filled quickly. Admiral Kim Soo-yang arrived first, her uniform still slightly wrinkled from sleep. She was younger than Jin-ho, but not by much, and she commanded the largest fleet humanity had ever built. Behind her came Commander Lee Tae-yoon, the strategic genius who had designed most of their defense systems, and Colonel Yoon Hana, whose job was to understand how enemies thought. They gathered around the main screen as the Velern transmission began to play. The alien who appeared on screen was massive. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in natural armor that looked like black stone. His eyes glowed red, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Creatures of Earth," the alien said, "I am War Master Vorath, servant of Grand Emperor Morthax the Eternal. Your world has been chosen for conquest. Your species has been marked for subjugation. You will surrender immediately, or you will be destroyed." The screen filled with images. Burning planets. Species being marched into slavery. Cities turned to glass by orbital bombardment. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who resist. "You've studied your kind," Vorath continued. "We know you are weak. We know you are divided. We know you have never faced a true enemy. Your weapons are toys. Your ships are paper. Your soldiers are soft and fragile, and will break at the first sign of real war." He leaned closer to the camera, his red eyes filling the screen. "You have one rotation of your planet to surrender. If you do not, we will begin the cleansing. Your cities will burn. Your people will scream. Your children will watch their parents die, and then they will die too. We will erase every trace of humanity from the universe, and in 1,000 years, no one will remember you ever existed." The transmission ended. The war room was silent. General Park Jin-ho stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Then he made a sound. It was small at first, just a little noise in the back of his throat. Admiral Kim Soo-young looked at him with concern, wondering if he was having some kind of breakdown. Then Jin-ho started laughing. It was not a nervous laugh. It was not a scared laugh. It was the deep, genuine laugh of a man who had just heard the funniest joke of his life. He laughed so hard that tears started rolling down his cheeks. He laughed until he had to grab the edge of the table to keep himself standing. Admiral Su Yang stared at him. Then she looked back at the screen where the aliens' threats had just played. Then she looked at Jinho again. And then, despite everything, she started laughing too. Commander Lee Tae-yoon tried to keep a straight face. He really did. But when Jinho wheezed out something about cleansing, Taeyeon lost control completely. He laughed so hard that coffee came out of his nose. Within 30 seconds, the entire war room was laughing. Generals, admirals, colonels, and captains, all of them, laughing like children at a comedy show. Some of them were crying. Some of them had to sit down. One young lieutenant laughed so hard she got hiccups. The Velern envoy, who was monitoring the transmission through a hidden probe, could not understand what he was seeing. His translator worked perfectly. The humans had clearly received the message. They understood every word, and yet they were laughing. He sent an urgent message back to War Master Vorath. The humans have received your declaration. They appear to be malfunctioning. Back on Luna Base, General Park Jinho finally managed to control himself. He wiped his eyes and took a deep breath. Around him, his officers were slowly recovering, though occasional giggles still escaped. Jinho said, his voice still shaking with amusement. "Oh, that was good. That was really good. Did he actually threaten to make us suffer?" "He did," Admiral Su Yang confirmed, grinning widely. "He also said our children would watch us die." "Classic commander," Taeyeon added. Very dramatic, Colonel Yoon Hana, who had managed to stay mostly composed, pulled up her datapad. "Should I begin preparing psychological profiles on the enemy, sir?" Jinho nodded, still smiling. "Yes, but first, someone send a message to the Velern fleet." "What should it say?" an aide asked. Jinho thought about it for a moment. Then his smile turned into something sharper, something that looked almost like pity. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that we accept their declaration of war. Tell them we look forward to meeting them in battle. And tell them," paused, looking around at his officers, at these men and women who had survived humanity's worst and were still standing, tell them that if they want to know what suffering really looks like, they should study our history books. We wrote the manual on it. He turned to face the window that looked out over the surface of the moon toward the distant blue dot that was Earth. "They think they're going to teach us about war," he said quietly. "They have no idea what they've just started." War Master Vorath paced back and forth in his command chamber, his heavy footsteps shaking the metal floor. The report from his envoy made no sense. He had delivered the war cry personally. He had shown them images of destroyed worlds. He had promised them death and suffering and complete annihilation, and they had laughed in 2,000 years of conquest. Vorath had seen many reactions to the war cry. He had seen species beg for mercy. He had seen them try to run. He had seen brave warriors accept death with dignity and cowards betray their own people to survive. But he had never, not once, seen anyone laugh. "Perhaps their translators malfunctioned," one of his officers suggested. "The translation was perfect," Vorath growled. "They understood every word. And perhaps they are insane. A species of madmen." Vorath turned to look at the blue planet on his screen. Such a small world. Such a young species. And yet something about their laughter bothered him in a way he could not explain. It was not the laugh of the ignorant. It was the laugh of someone who knew something he did not. He pushed the thought away. It did not matter. Superior firepower always won in the end. The humans would learn this lesson soon enough. On Luna Base, the laughter had stopped, but the smiles had not. General Park Jinho had called a full strategic meeting, and the war room was now packed with humanity's best military minds. They had work to do. Colonel Yoon Hana stood at the front of the room, her datapad connected to the main screen. She had spent the last 12 hours analyzing every piece of information they had about the Velern Empire. And what she had found explained everything. "The Velern have been conquering species for over 2,000 years, she began. In that time, they have never lost a war, not once. They have faced enemies with better technology, larger populations, and more resources. And they have crushed every single one of them. She paused to let that sink in. But here's the important part. They have never faced an enemy like us. Not because we are stronger or smarter or more advanced, but because every species they have conquered had one thing in common. She tapped her pad, and the screen filled with data. Every single one of them evolved on peaceful worlds. Worlds without predators. Worlds without natural disasters. Worlds where food was plentiful and survival was easy. These species developed intelligence, built civilizations, and reached the stars without ever having to fight for their existence. Admiral Kim Su-yang leaned forward in her chair, and then the Velern showed up. Exactly, Hannah said. The Velern were the first real threat these species had ever faced. They had no concept of war, no military history, no understanding of violence beyond theory. When the Velern arrived with their massive fleet and their terrifying war cry, these species had two choices: surrender or die. Most chose surrender. The few who chose to fight had no idea how to do it. Commander Lee Tae-yoon was nodding slowly. So the Velorn have never fought anyone who actually knows how to fight.
I'll actually be worse than that, Hannah said.
They've never fought anyone who has spent their entire existence fighting themselves. She changed the display to show Earth's history. Wars. So many wars. The screen filled with images that made even the hardened officers in the room uncomfortable. Trenches filled with bodies. Cities reduced to rubble. Mushroom clouds rising over burned landscapes. Soldiers charging into certain death with smiles on their faces. Humanity has been at war with itself since before we could write, Hannah continued. We invented weapons before we invented medicine. We created nuclear bombs before we created vaccines for most diseases. We have killed billions of our own people over things as small as lines on a map or disagreements about gods that may not even exist. She turned to face the room. The Velern think we are weak, because we are soft and short-lived. They think we will break because we have no natural armor. But they do not understand that our weakness is exactly what made us dangerous. We had to become dangerous to survive. We had to learn to fight, to kill, to sacrifice everything for victory. It is written into our very nature. General Park Jin-ho stood up. What else do we know about their military doctrine? Captain Baek Young-ji from Naval Intelligence took over. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She had spent her entire career studying alien species, preparing for the day humanity would finally make contact with hostile forces. The Velorn military operates on a strict hierarchy, she explained. Every ship, every soldier, every unit follows orders from above, without question. They do not adapt. They do not improvise. They follow the plan until the plan succeeds.
Oh.
And if the plan fails, Admiral Su-yang asked. It has never failed, Yoon-ji said. At least, not in any way that mattered. When you have overwhelming force and your enemy has no idea how to resist, you do not need backup plans. You do not need flexibility. You just need to keep pushing until they break. Commander Tae-yoon was already thinking ahead. So if we remove their command structure, their entire military freezes, Yoon-ji confirmed. They will wait for orders that never come. They literally cannot function without someone telling them what to do. The room was quiet as everyone processed this information. The Velorn were not invincible. They were not even particularly smart about warfare. They had simply never needed to be. They had won every war through sheer force and the psychological impact of their reputation. But reputation meant nothing to humans. Humans had faced extinctional-level threats before. They had survived ice ages, plagues, and 2 world wars that had nearly destroyed civilization. They had built nuclear weapons capable of ending all life on Earth, and had somehow managed not to use them. They had stared into the void and refused to blink. General Park Jin-ho walked to the front of the room. He looked at the faces of his officers. These men and women who had been trained their entire lives for a war they never expected to fight. The Velorn made a mistake, he said. They studied our biology and our technology and our infrastructure. They counted our ships and measured our weapons and calculated our population. And based on all of that, they decided we would be easy to conquer. He smiled, and there was something cold in that smile. But they did not study our history. They did not learn what we did to each other at Stalingrad, or in the trenches of France, or in the jungles of Vietnam. They do not know about the 300 Spartans who held a pass against an army of millions, or the civilians who refused to leave London while bombs fell on their homes every night. He turned to look at the screen, which still showed images of humanity's bloody past. They think they understand suffering. They think they understand war, but they learned war from conquering species that had never fought before. They learned suffering from creatures that surrendered at the first sign of pain. His voice hardened. They learned war from ourselves. We learned suffering from 10,000 years of doing terrible things to each other. And if the Velen want to add humanity to their collection of conquered species, they are going to have to earn it. He turned back to face his officers. They gave us 1 day to surrender. Let us use that day to show them exactly what they have gotten themselves into. Admiral Su Yang, I want our fleet ready to move within 6 hours. Commander Taiyun, start working on attack plans that do not involve direct confrontation. Colonel Hannah, I want every piece of psychological warfare we have prepared and ready. He paused, looking around the room one more time. The Velen think this war will be quick and easy. They think we will break like all the others. They are wrong. His smile returned, sharp and dangerous. We are humanity. We do not break. We break others. The deadline passed. Earth did not surrender. War Master Voroth gave the order to advance. And 5,000 Veleron warships began their slow march toward the human homeworld. He expected resistance. He expected desperation. He expected the humans to gather their pathetic little fleet and make a brave but ultimately pointless last stand. Instead, he found nothing. The first Velen scout ships entered human space and reported empty darkness. No defense platforms. No minefield. No fleet waiting in formation. Just cold, silent space, stretching out toward the distant blue planet. Voroth was confused, but not concerned. Perhaps the humans had chosen to surrender after all. Perhaps they were hiding on their planet, hoping the Velen would show mercy. Either way, it did not matter. He gave the order to continue the advance. That was his second mistake. 3 days into the invasion, supply ship Eternal Glory exploded without warning. One moment it was traveling safely in the middle of the fleet formation. The next moment, it was a cloud of burning metal spreading across space. There had been no attack, no warning, no enemy ships anywhere on sensors. The Velen investigated and found the remains of a small device attached to the ship's fuel system. It was human technology, primitive but effective. Someone had planted it before the invasion even began. Over the next 2 weeks, 17 more supply ships suffered similar fates. Each explosion was different, some in the engines, some in the ammunition storage, some in the life support systems. The devices were never detected before they activated. The Velen engineers could not figure out how humans had gotten past their security to plant them. The answer was simple. They had not gotten past security. The devices had been placed years ago by human traders and diplomats who had visited Velen space under the guise of peaceful contact. The humans had been preparing for this war long before the Velen even knew. Earth existed, but the supply ships were just the beginning. Major Choi Dong-wook led the first strike team. His ship was small, barely larger than a fighter, designed for speed and stealth rather than firepower. He and his crew of 12 had trained for years in hit-and-run tactics. Learning from humanity's long history of guerrilla warfare, they waited in the asteroid belt near Neptune, hidden among millions of rocks that looked exactly like their ship on sensors. When a Velen patrol group passed nearby, they struck. Not at the combat ships, those were too well defended. They hit the communication relay instead. The attack lasted exactly 47 seconds. Dongwook's ship emerged from the asteroids, fired 6 precision missiles at the relay's power core, and disappeared back into the rocks before the Velen could even raise their shields. The relay exploded, cutting off communications between the patrol group and the main fleet. The patrol commander tried to send scouts to reconnect with the fleet. Each scout ship that left the group was destroyed by more hidden attackers. Lieutenant Shin Naeon commanded one of these teams, and she had learned patience from the snipers of old Earth. She could wait for hours, perfectly still, until her target was exactly where she wanted it. By the time the Veleran patrol finally reached the main fleet, they had lost half their ships and their commander. It aged visibly from stress, and this was just the beginning. Admiral Kim Soo-yang commanded the main human fleet, but she had no intention of using it in a direct fight. Instead, she used it as bait. The Veleran sensors would detect her ships, and the alien fleet would change course to engage. Then, just before contact, Soo-yang would order a retreat. The Veleran followed. They always followed. Their doctrine demanded that they destroy any enemy force they encountered. So Soo-yang led them on a chase through human space, always staying just ahead of their weapons range, always retreating before they could close the distance. What the Veleran did not realize was that Soo-yang was leading them through carefully prepared killing fields. Every asteroid belt had hidden weapons platforms. Every gas giant had ships waiting in the clouds. Every moon and planet and piece of space debris was a potential ambush site. The humans did not fight fair. They fought like the predators their ancestors had been, using every advantage, exploiting every weakness. Commander Lee Tion coordinated the attacks from Luna Base. Watching the Valoran fleet's movements on a massive tactical display, he had studied every human war in history. From ancient battles fought with swords and spears to the nuclear nightmares of the 20th century, he knew 1,000 ways to destroy an enemy without ever meeting them in open battle. The Veleran were learning these lessons the hard way. Their fleet was dying slowly, ship by ship, day by day. The humans never engaged in the glorious battles that Veleran warriors had trained for. Instead, they struck at night toward what passed for night on the ships when crews were tired and reaction times were slow. They targeted officers and commanders, using intelligence gathered by Sergeant Han Minji and her cyber warfare team. Minji had infiltrated the Veleran computer networks within the first week of the war. Their security was surprisingly weak. They had never needed strong protection, because no conquered species had ever tried to hack them. Now, Mingyi could read their orders before the Veleran commanders received them. She knew their patrol routes, their supply schedules, their command codes. She used this information to cause chaos. False orders sent ships to wrong locations. Fake distress signals lured rescue teams into ambushes. Communication channels filled with strange human music that drove Veleran soldiers mad with its alien rhythms. One Valoran captain received orders to attack his own flagship and nearly succeeded before someone stopped him. The Valoran tried to adapt. They increased security. They changed their codes. They sent hunters to find the hidden human bases. But humans were good at hiding. They had spent thousands of years hiding from each other, developing camouflage and deception and misdirection into art forms. War Master Voreth grew frustrated. His glorious invasion had become a nightmare of shadows and ghosts. His soldiers were exhausted, jumping at every sensor glitch, afraid to sleep, because attacks always came when they rested. Morale was collapsing. Some crews had started refusing orders, terrified of being sent out alone, and the humans kept laughing. That was the worst part. Whenever Veleran forces captured a human, which was rare, because humans preferred death to capture, the prisoner would laugh. They would laugh when questioned. They would laugh when threatened. They would laugh even as they died, as if the whole war was some enormous joke that only they understood. Voroth sent a message to Grand Emperor Morthox, requesting reinforcements. The Emperor denied the request. The Veleran Empire was vast, and there were other wars to fight. Surely 5,000 ships were enough to conquer one small species. Vorath did not argue. He simply returned to his command chamber and stared at the tactical display, showing his slowly shrinking fleet. He had lost nearly 2,000 ships in 2 months. He had yet to see Earth with his own eyes. The humans had turned space itself into a weapon. Every jump point could be an ambush. Every debris field could hide missiles. Every quiet moment could be the prelude to another attack. The Veleran were not fighting an enemy anymore. They were fighting an environment that wanted them dead. And somewhere, On a small blue planet still far away, General Park Jin-ho watched the reports coming in and smiled. The war was not over. The hardest part was still to come. But the Velarin were learning the same lesson that humanity's own tyrants had learned throughout history. You could not conquer people who simply refused to be conquered. You could kill them, yes. You could burn their cities and destroy their armies. But as long as even one of them remained alive, they would keep fighting. They would fight with weapons if they had them, and with rocks if they did not. They would fight until their last breath, and then their children would pick up where they left. This was the human way of war. It was ugly and brutal and completely without honor. But it worked, and the Velarin were just beginning to understand what that meant. 3 months into the war, the Velarin Empire faced something it had never experienced before: doubt. War Master Vorath stood in his command chamber, staring at numbers that made no sense. His fleet had shrunk from 5,000 ships to just under 3,000. He had lost nearly 40% of his invasion force without ever fighting a real battle. His soldiers were exhausted, paranoid, and beginning to whisper that the humans could not be defeated. Worse, the humans had started leaving messages. After every attack, after every destroyed ship and killed crew, the humans would leave something behind. Sometimes it was written on debris. Sometimes it was broadcast on emergency channels. Sometimes it was carved into the hulls of crippled ships before the final killing blow. The messages were always the same. We can do this forever. Vorath did not understand what that meant at first. Of course, they could not do this forever. Resources were limited. Populations were finite. Eventually, one side would run out of ships and soldiers and the will to continue fighting. But as the weeks passed, Vorath began to realize the horrible truth. The humans meant it literally. They had designed their entire military strategy around endless warfare. Their ships were cheap and easy to build. Their soldiers volunteered for suicide missions with smiles on their faces. Their factories worked day and night, producing weapons faster than the Velarin could destroy them. The humans were not trying to win the war. They were trying to make it last forever. On Earth, the mood was different. There was no celebration. Too many lives had been lost for that. But there was a grim satisfaction in knowing that the plan was working. General Park Jin-ho had predicted this moment 3 months ago, when he first heard the Velarin war cry. He had known then that this war would not be won through strength, but through endurance. Now, it was time for the final phase. Admiral Kim Soo-young gathered the full Earth fleet for the first time since the war began. 700 warships, ranging from massive battlecruisers to nimble destroyers, assembled near Saturn's largest moon. This was everything humanity had. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier who could hold a gun. The Velarin detected the gathering immediately. Their sensors showed the human fleet forming into a traditional battle formation, exactly what they had been waiting for. Vorath felt a surge of hope. Finally, after months of shadow warfare, the humans were going to fight like real warriors. Finally, could crush them in open battle. He ordered his entire remaining fleet to intercept. What happened next would be remembered for 1,000 years. As the two fleets approached each other, the human ships began broadcasting a message. Not a war cry. Not threats or demands for surrender. Something else entirely. It was a history lesson. On every Velarin screen, images began to appear. At first, the alien soldiers did not understand what they were seeing. The pictures showed humans, small, soft, weak humans, fighting each other. But the scale was wrong. The violence was wrong. Everything was wrong. They saw Thermopylae, where 300 warriors held a mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. They fought until every single one of them was dead, and they died smiling. Knowing they had bought their people time to escape, they saw where 2 million soldiers tore a city apart brick by brick, fighting for every building, every room, every staircase. Humans freezing to death in the snow, humans starving in bombed-out basements. Humans killing each other with knives and rocks and bare hands when their ammunition ran out. They saw the trenches of the First World War, where men lived like animals in mud and filth, where they climbed out of their holes every morning knowing they would probably die. And they did it anyway because someone told them to. They saw Hiroshima, and the Veleran soldiers grew quiet. A single bomb, one small device, and an entire city erased in a flash of light. 200,000 lives ended in a heartbeat. And the humans had done this to themselves. They saw Vietnam, where farmers with ancient rifles defeated the most powerful military on their planet through sheer refusal to quit. They saw the Blitz, where civilians endured months of bombing and went to work the next morning anyway. They saw Rwanda and Cambodia and Syria and 100 other places where humans had proven, again and again, that they were capable of horrors beyond imagination. And through it all, they heard General Park Jin-ho's voice. "You want to conquer us?" he said. His words translated into the Veleran language. "You want to make us suffer? You want to break us and add us to your empire of slaves?" The images kept coming. Concentration camps, mass graves, nuclear tests, biological weapons. Every atrocity humanity had ever committed against itself, displayed in terrible detail. But you do not understand what you are asking for. We have been trying to destroy ourselves for 10,000 years. Every empire in our history has promised to end us. Every tyrant has claimed he would be the one to finally break the human spirit. The screen showed images of those tyrants: Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, Genghis Khan, men who had commanded millions, who had conquered continents, who had seemed unstoppable in their time. And we are still here. Jin-ho's face appeared on screen and his eyes were hard as stone. "You are not the first to threaten us. You will not be the last. And if you want to know what suffering really looks like, study these images carefully. We wrote the manual on it." He leaned forward. "Today you will face the full strength of humanity. Not because we need to. We could continue this shadow war for years, bleeding you slowly until nothing remains. But we want you to understand something. We want you to remember this day for as long as your empire exists." The human fleet began to move, accelerating toward the Veleran formation. "We do not fight because we enjoy it. We do not kill because we want to. We fight because we must. We kill because that is what we are. We are predators. We evolved on a planet that tried to murder us every single day, and we survived by becoming the most dangerous thing on it." Commander An Sung-woo led the fighter squadrons. His small ship racing ahead of the main fleet, he was screaming with joy, his pilots echoing him through the radio. This was what they had trained for. This was the moment they had dreamed of. "You called us weak," Jin-ho continued. "You called us soft. You said we would break like all the others." The two fleets met in a storm of fire and light. You were wrong. The Battle of Titan's Shadow lasted 6 hours. The humans fought with a fury that the Veleran had never seen, had never imagined possible. Ships rammed into each other. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in corridors slick with blood. Pilots flew their damaged fighters directly into enemy bridges, dying with laughter on their lips. The Veleran fought back, of course. They were warriors, trained for battle, veterans of 100 conquests. But there is a difference between fighting an enemy who wants to survive and fighting an enemy who does not care if they live or die one by one. The Veleran ships began to fall. Admiral Su-yang commanded from the bridge of her flagship, calmly giving orders as the chaos raged around her. She had lost count of how many friends had died today. She would mourn them later. Now, there was only the battle. The Veleran flagship, carrying War Master Vorath himself, was the last to fall. Its shields collapsed under the combined fire of a dozen human ships. Its engines exploded, leaving it drifting and helpless. Vorath gave one final order before his command chamber lost power. Retreat. For the first time in Valoran history, an invasion fleet fled from its enemy. The surviving ships turned and ran, jumping too faster than light speed without coordination, without orders, without any thought except escape. On the bridge of her damaged flagship, Admiral Kim Su-yang watched them go. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, and 2 of her officers lay dead at their stations. But she was smiling. "Admiral," her communications officer said, "we are receiving a transmission from the Veleran command ship. It is ... It is War Master Vorath. Su Yang straightened up. Put him through. Vorath's face appeared on screen. He looked old now, broken, his red eyes dim with something that might have been fear. Why? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why did you show us those images? Why did you want us to see what you have done to yourselves? Su Yang looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because we wanted you to understand, she said quietly. We are capable of anything. There is no limit to what we will do to survive. And now that you have seen the truth of us, now that you know what we really are, she leaned forward and her smile was not kind. We want you to tell the others. Tell your emperor. Tell every species in your empire. Tell them what happens when you threaten humanity. Tell them about the species that has been trying to destroy itself for 10,000 years and has failed every single time. He paused. And tell them this. If they ever come for us again, we will not stop with defense. We will follow them home. And what we did to ourselves, we will do to them. The transmission ended. In the silence that followed, Admiral Su Yang finally allowed herself to cry. 1 year after the invasion began, the Velern Empire sent a single ship to Earth. It carried no weapons, no soldiers, no threats. It carried only an ambassador and a question. Grand Emperor Morthax. The Eternal had not slept well since his fleet returned from human space. The reports haunted him. The videos haunted him more. He had watched the human history lesson 100 times. Trying to understand how such a small, weak species could be capable of such terrible things, he had ruled the Velern Empire for 300 years. He had conquered more worlds than any emperor before him. He had believed himself to be the most powerful being in the galaxy. The master of all, he surveyed now. For the first time in his long life, he was afraid. The ambassador he sent was named Korath, one of his most trusted advisors. Korath's mission was simple: find out if peace was possible. The alternative was unthinkable. The humans had made it clear that if the war continued, they would eventually come for the Velern homeworld. And after what Morthax had seen, he believed them. The human fleet escorted Korath's ship to Earth, but they did not threaten him. They seemed almost friendly in their strange human way. One of the human captains even wished him luck before signing off. Korath arrived on Earth on a bright spring morning. The planet was more beautiful than he had expected. Green forests, blue oceans, white clouds drifting through clear skies. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful-looking world had produced the warriors who had nearly destroyed his empire. General Park Jin-ho met him at the Seoul Diplomatic Center, a building that had been rebuilt after the corporate wars half a century ago. Jin-ho had aged since the war began. There was more gray in his hair, more lines on his face, but his eyes were still sharp, still dangerous, still holding that hint of amusement that made Korath deeply uncomfortable. Standing beside Jin-ho were the other heroes of the war. Admiral Kim Su-yang, who had commanded the fleet at Titan's shadow. Commander Lee Taeyan, whose strategies had turned the invasion into a nightmare. Colonel Yoon Hana, who understood Velern psychology better than most Velern did, and dozens of others. The soldiers and officers who had fought and bled and refused to surrender. Korath bowed deeply, a gesture of respect that Velern rarely showed to other species. General Park, he said, his translator turning his words into human language. I come on behalf of Grand Emperor Morthax the Eternal. He wishes to discuss an end to hostilities. Jin-ho nodded, gesturing to a seat at the large round table that filled the center of the room. Please sit. Would you like something to drink? We have tea, coffee, water. Korath stared at him. He had expected many things from this meeting. He had expected anger, demands, threats. He had not expected hospitality. Water would be acceptable, he said carefully, sitting down. A young aide brought water for the ambassador and coffee for the humans. The room was quiet as everyone took their seats. Korath looked around at the faces watching him. Some showed curiosity. Some showed suspicion. A few showed what might have been sympathy. Before we begin, Jin-ho said, I want you to understand something. We did not want this war. We never wanted to fight the Velern Empire. We were happy to stay in our small corner of the galaxy, exploring and building and trying to become better than we were. He took a sip of his coffee. But when your fleet arrived at our borders and demanded our surrender, we had no choice. We have spent our entire history fighting those who would destroy us. It is what we do. It is what we are. Korath nodded slowly. We understand this now. Better than we wished to. Good. Jinho set down his cup. Then let us talk about the future. The negotiations lasted 3 days. The Veleran wanted peace, and they were willing to pay for it. They offered territory, resources, technology, anything, to ensure that the human threat would not turn toward their homeworld. But Ginho did not want any of those things. We want only 2 things, he said on the final day of talks. First, we want the Veleran Empire to leave us alone. No more invasions. No more threats. No more war cries broadcast to our people. We will stay in our space, and you will stay in yours. Korath agreed immediately. And the second thing? Ginho exchanged a look with Admiral Su Yang. Then he turned back to Korath with a smile that was somehow both warm and terrifying. We want an alliance. Korath froze. Alliance. You have the largest military in the galaxy, Jinho explained. We have other skills. Together, we could do things that neither of us could do alone. Explore, trade, maybe even help some of those species you conquered learn to stand on their own feet. You would work with us? Korath could not hide his disbelief. After everything we did? After we tried to destroy you? Admiral Su Yang laughed softly. It was not a cruel laugh, but it made Korath flinch anyway. Ambassador, she said, do you know how many times humans have tried to destroy other humans? How many empires have risen and fallen on our single planet? How many times we have come within moments of ending our own civilization? Korath shook his head. Neither do we, she admitted. We lost count long ago. But here's the important thing. After every war, after every genocide, after every apocalypse we inflicted on ourselves, we always found a way to forgive. Not forget, never forget, but forgive. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting Korath's. We are not good at peace. We never have been. But we keep trying anyway, because the alternative is extinction, and we are far too stubborn to accept that. Korath was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since his fleet had first retreated from human space. When we declared war, he said, when War Master Vorath delivered the war cry and promised your extinction, why did you laugh? We have studied every moment of that transmission. We have analyzed every reaction, and we still do not understand. Why did you find it funny? General Park Jinho leaned back in his chair. He looked at Su Yang, at Taeyeon, at Hana, at all the officers who had been in that war room on the day that everything changed. A small smile played on his lips. Because we have heard that speech before, he said simply, from ourselves. Every tyrant in human history has promised to destroy us. Every conqueror has claimed he would be the one to finally end the human race. They used different words, different languages, different technologies, but the message was always the same. He shrugged. You are not the first to threaten us with extinction, Ambassador. You will not be the last. And honestly, compared to what we have done to ourselves, your war cry was almost ... polite. Korath stared at him. Then, slowly, his face did something that no human had ever seen a Veleran face do before. He laughed. It was an awkward sound. Rough and unfamiliar, like a machine that had never been used before. But it was unmistakably laughter. Korath, ambassador of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, was laughing at the absurdity of it all. The treaty was signed that evening. The Veleran-Human Alliance would go on to become one of the most significant partnerships in galactic history. Together, the two species explored thousands of new worlds. They freed dozens of conquered civilizations. They built wonders that neither could have imagined alone. In the centuries that followed, other species would ask the Veleran about humanity. They wanted to know the truth about the strange, soft creatures who had humiliated the greatest military power in the galaxy. The Veleran always answered the same way. Humans are not the strongest species, they would say. They are not the smartest or the fastest or the most advanced. They die easily. They break down often. They make mistakes constantly. The questioner would look confused. Then how did they defeat you? And the Valorn would smile. They had learned to smile from the humans and say, because they simply refused to quit. No matter what we did to them, no matter how many we killed, no matter how hopeless their situation became, they would not stop fighting. They would not surrender. They would not give up. A pause. In a universe full of species that fear death, humanity is unique. They're afraid to, of course. But their fear does not stop them. Their fear does not control them. When we threatened to destroy them, they looked at us and laughed because they had already faced destruction 1,000 times. They had destroyed themselves and rebuilt from the ashes again and again. What was one more apocalypse to a species that had survived so many? Another pause, longer this time. That is why they won. Not because they were strong, but because they were stubborn, and in the end, stubbornness beats strength every single time. On Earth, in the centuries that followed, humans continued to be human. They still fought each other sometimes. They still made terrible mistakes. They still struggled with the darkness that lived inside every one of them. But they also built. They dreamed. They reached for the stars and kept reaching, even when the stars seemed impossibly far away. They carried their history with them, all of it, the beautiful and the terrible, because they knew that forgetting the past meant repeating it. And whenever a new threat appeared, whenever some alien power looked at humanity and saw only weakness, the humans would gather together. They would remember the Valoran invasion. They would remember the war cry that had made their generals laugh, and they would show the universe. Once again, what it meant to be human, they would endure. They would fight. They would survive because that was what they did. That was what they had always done, and that was what they would do forever.